Good evening. Good evening. Lovely to see you all. I'd like to welcome you this fine Wednesday evening, where I hope you'll keep your coats on. But it's lovely to have you. Thank you. I know that for most of us here, this building is familiar for all kinds of ways that we've lived amongst this community. We've met here as the Marching Society, and then we've got church members as well, and of course we have a massive overlap of the two groups. But I'd just like to welcome you all. I'm Emma. I worship here, and I live the other side of the village. And so I just wanted to, just by way of introduction, introduce our dear friend James. You'll know that James Allan is Emeritus Fellow and Professor of Eastern Art at St Cross College and one of the lay preachers here at All Saints. For me, he is what we call my home group leader. So those of us in church, we gather into the homes during the week, and we often discuss what's said in the sermons on Sunday. And I just think that's a really good example of hearing what's preached, but also having time to unpack it for ourselves and own it for ourselves. I think we want to be thinking people and thinking Christians. And for James, he helps us unpack those things with his background. But also, I always love the fact that James is never shy of asking the unanswerable question. And I think, he would have liked that from his students amongst the years. But I find that easy for me to ask what I want and know that no one will judge me for that. So this evening is about unpacking what to me initially was a really tricky passage in my sacred text, the Bible, the Word of God. But actually, we have someone who can help show that in all of its glory. And I know that you'll really enjoy what James brings to us this evening. Before he comes, we're going to ask Katrine Jones if she will read Ezekiel chapter 1, which you'll find on the Bibles in the pews if you want to follow it, page 830. She read this on the Sunday that we had this as a sermon when Kevin was preaching, and sat down and thought, oh, good, I won't need to read that again.
Ever again.
And now we've asked her back. So thank you very, very much, Katrina.
It's a pleasure. My pleasure. Ezekiel chapter 1. In the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day, while I was among the exiles by the Kibar River, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. On the 5th of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Joachim, when the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel, the priest, the son of Buzai, by the Kibar River in the land of the Babylonians. There, the hand of the Lord was upon him. I looked, and I saw a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning and surrounded by brilliant light. The center of the fire looked like glowing metal, and in the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. In appearance, their form was that of a man, but each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. Their legs were straight, their feet were like those of a calf, and gleamed like burnished bronze. Under their wings, on their 4 sides, they had the hands of a man. All 4 of them had faces and wings, and their wings touched one another. Each one went straight ahead. They did not turn as they moved. And their faces looked like this. Each of the 4 had a face of a man, and on the right side had the face of a lion, and on the left the face of an ox. Each also had the face of an eagle. Such were their faces. Their wings were spread out upwards. Each had 2 wings, one touching the wing of another creature on either side, and 2 wings covering its body. Each one went straight ahead. Wherever the Spirit would go, they would go, without turning as they went. The appearance of the living creatures was like burning coals of fire, or like torches. Fire moved back and forth among the creatures. It was bright, and lightning flashed out of it. The creatures sped back and forth like flashes of lightning. As I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the ground beside each creature with its 4 faces. This was the appearance and the structure of the wheels. They sparkled like chrysolite, and all 4 looked alike. Each appeared to be made like a wheel intersecting a wheel. As they moved, they would go in any of the 4 directions the creatures faced. The wheels did not turn about as the creatures went. Their rims were high and awesome, and all 4 rims were full of eyes all around. When the living creatures moved, the wheels beside them moved, and when the living creatures rose from the ground, the wheels rose also. Wherever the Spirit would go, they would go, and the wheels would rise along with them, because the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. When the creatures moved, they also moved. When the creatures stood still, they also stood still. And when the creatures rose from the ground, the wheels rose along with them, because of the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. Spread out above the heads of the living creatures was what looked like an expanse sparkling like ice and awesome. Under the expanse, their wings were stretched out, one towards the other, and each had 2 wings covering its body. When the creatures moved, I heard the sound of their wings like the roar of rushing waters, like the voice of the Almighty, like the tumult of an army. When they stood still, they lowered their wings. Then there came a voice from above the expanse over their heads as they stood with lowered wings. Above the expanse over their heads, what looked like the throne of sapphire, and high above on the throne was a figure like that of a man. I saw that from what appeared to be his waist up, he looked like glowing metal, as if full of fire, and that from there down he looked like fire, and brilliant light surrounded him, like the appearance of a rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day. So was the radiance around him. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord, and when I saw it, I fell face down, and I heard the voice of one speaking.
To me. Thank you, Katrina, for reading. I'm sorry you've had to repeat it when you've done it once already in your life. I must tell you at the start of this that I've long since retired from my university teaching, but occasionally an academic challenge comes my way which I find irresistible. And it was Kevin's sermon a month ago that set me off on this road, so my thanks to him for getting me motivated to look further into Ezekiel's vision and its symbolism. But I'd like to make it clear that it's not my academic speciality. I'm an Islamic art historian. I don't know Akkadian nor Aramaic, and I can't read cuneiform. However, I've discovered that there's a huge amount of information out there which helps us understand the background to Ezekiel's book, quite apart from the symbolism of the vision he had of God's glory. So I've got pretty excited about it, and I hope you will too. I'll turn to Ezekiel's vision in a minute or two, but first I need to briefly outline the history of the period, because that affects the cultural interchanges of which the Israelites were part. David's kingdom, I'm afraid it's a bit small here, but there we are, there's Jerusalem and Judah, and the northern kingdom was just above it. Judah, the southern kingdom, so that's where the Israelites are. They always were a buffer between Mesopotamia, the Assyrian Empire, and Egypt, caught in the middle and influenced by both. Egypt dominated the early periods of Israelite kingship, but the rise of the Assyrians in the 8th century and the Neo-Babylonians in the 7th century BC first brought about the eclipse of the northern tribes and then disaster for Judah. Tiglath-Pileser, who is the top of the kings of Assyria on the list there, captured much of the northern kingdom in 732 and appointed Israel's last king, Hoshea. Hoshea then rebelled, hoping for Egyptian support. However, that brought about the end of Israel, with the capture of its capital Samaria in 721 by Sargon II. There he is. Sargon took the population of the northern kingdom back to Assyria and brought other people from Mesopotamia to settle Samaria. Sargon records that he deported 27,290 Israelites. Ashurbanipal was the last great Assyrian king. There he is. And I'll be showing you quite a number of images taken from his reign. He conquered Egypt as well as Syria. Judah, the southern kingdom, then bowed to his overlordship. Following his death, however, in around about 630, Egypt and Judah tried to take advantage of Assyrian weakness to reassert themselves. The Neo-Babylonian Empire then took over Assyria, and the Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar, down here at the bottom, Nebuchadnezzar II, laid siege to Jerusalem, where he defeated the Egyptians in 605 at the Battle of Carchemish. So you can see that Egypt controlled all this area of the Levant at that point, but they were defeated at the Battle of Carchemish up here by Nebuchadnezzar. And then he moved south, and 598 he laid siege to Jerusalem, leading to the first of 3 deportations. He reduced Judah to vassal status, and King Jehoiakim was taken to Babylon. There we are. Where he was actually quite well looked after. But Judah rebelled again in 587, and a second deportation to Babylonia followed, but this time the king of Judah, Zedekiah, was less fortunate. He was blinded as well as deported. And the assassination of Gedaliah, who was appointed governor of Judah by the Babylonians, led to the final third deportation in 582 and the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. So the first question I want to ask is, how did a deportation work? Well, in the 1980s, huge number of clay tablets were found somewhere in Assyria or Iraq, and numerous volumes of them have gradually been published. They're written in cuneiform. They date from the period between 572 and 477, so from the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II down into the Achaemenid period. And many of them are tax returns of the Jewish community under the Babylonians. A word on language at this point. The Assyrians and Babylonians had always written in cuneiform on clay tablets, whereas the Egyptians had used papyrus. However, by Ezekiel's time, writing was changing in the Near East. The large numbers of Arameans from Syria living in the empire, due to Assyrian deportations, led to Aramaic becoming the most used language, and with it came the use of scrolls and a different alphabet. Written in cuneiform, which is shown here, the Assyrian and Babylonian language, Akkadian is the name of the language, was a logosyllabic script. That is, it included word signs and syllabic signs. Aramaic, on the other hand, used an alphabetic script consisting of a mere 22 consonants, but no vowels. And it was much easier and simpler language altogether. The Babylonians used Akkadian and hence cuneiform as their official royal language, but Aramaic had become the administrative language and lingua franca of the empire. The use of a scroll in Ezekiel 3, verse 1, indicates that Ezekiel is very much part of the Babylonian world of his day. On the other hand, the use of a tile or brick in Ezekiel 4, verse 1, a chapter later, on which Ezekiel, you may remember, draws the city of Jerusalem, could, because the brick is made of clay, draw attention to the fact that the siege of Jerusalem was Nebuchadnezzar's royal policy. So that's just a little illustration of clay and scrolls. But that's a diversion. Let's return to the hundreds of clay tablets dating from 572 to 477. And these show 3 things of interest to us. First, the aristocracy of the conquered territories were kept in the capital in Babylon, where they could be controlled. Secondly, ordinary people from the captured lands were settled on the land in Babylonia and eventually made a comfortable living growing crops, trading, paying taxes, building houses, and so on. There were a large number of captured individuals of other Near Eastern origins alongside the Judeans. Other Semitic groups from Syria, which are mentioned on this map, all these folks down here, there's Aram, which gives the language Aramaic, but down here are not only Israel and Judah, but Ammon, Moab, Edom, and then, of course, down into Egypt. And then there are the other peoples who live up in towards Asia Minor. The linguistic problems this created was considerable in the empire. For example, among the Levantine languages the empire had to deal with were Ugaritic, Phoenician, Moabite, Edomite, and Hebrew, and Ashurbanipal's annals include an unfortunately broken tablet with a report on a messenger from the king of Lydia. And Lydia was up here, north of Cilicia in Asia Minor. The king of Lydia, and the messenger from him came with some sort of message to Ashurbanipal, but unfortunately he spoke a language which no one in Babylon could understand, so it didn't get very far, the message, I'm afraid. The Judeans would have been in close contact with all these different groups, as also with the Babylonian population, through military service or corvée labour, that is unpaid obligatory labour at the dictate of the government. Hence, Ezekiel 3, verse 4, "Son of man, go now to the people of Israel and speak my words to them. You are not being sent to a people of obscure speech and strained languages, but to the people of Israel." In other words, ignore all these other linguistic groups. You don't have to worry about them. Just speak to yours, the Israelites. Now, Ezekiel was part of the first deportation of 598 BC. According to Ezekiel 1:1 and Ezekiel 3:15, he'd been living for 5 years by the river Kibar at a place called Tel Abib, when he had his vision. So that was in 593. It seems that the word translated as river here, Nahar, can mean more generally a waterway or canal, and much of Mesopotamia was indeed full of irrigation canals. So the mention of the river Kibar is important, for it indicates the type of settlement and the setting of the vision. So we'll just go back to the map. A mention in an Akkadian text suggests that the Kibar was south of Babylon, down here, whereas the area described in the clay tablets I've mentioned was northwest of Nineveh, up here, further up the Tigris. However, it's instructive to see how that group of Judeans were living, because it throws light on the fate of deportees elsewhere in Babylonia. The area on the Tigris described on the tablets was a previously abandoned part of Assyria, and Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, had large works undertaken to irrigate it. Canals were dug, new settlements emerged, and groups of deportees were evidently settled there to do the work, including Judeans. We can assume that the first generation was made to dig the canals, build water storage ponds, and lay out fields. Once these were operational, the deportees would have received land along these canals, linked with an obligation to pay taxes and to perform a certain amount of public service, be it military or corvée labour. These duties could evidently last up to 2 months per year and were usually carried out far away from their homes. Again, we see how people would have got mixed together. And it's from this stage of settlement, the settlement process, that the records that have survived come, when the area started to thrive economically and began to generate taxes together with documents of administrative importance. First generation holding would have been enough to keep a family alive as long as they succeed in cultivating the land step by step, starting with the most fertile and profitable stretches close to the river or canal. They would then have extended cultivation to the point where the irrigation system would fail and the flow taper off, but watering by bucket was still possible. The irrigated stretch under perfect conditions could reach up to 2 kilometres away from the canal. At its source, the water needed to be lifted several metres into a storage pond to allow regulating its flow onto the fields. This was done by what is called today a shadoof, a bucket with a counterweight, or by the Archimedes screw, which the Greeks will be disappointed to know was probably invented in the reign of Sennacherib. That's around about 700 BC. To raise water to higher levels, a series of shadoofs or screws would be mounted one above the other. The main focus of the Judean archive is agricultural production, particularly grain and date palm cultivation. The grain could be produced following the first sowing. However, it would have taken many years from the planting of the date palms before the date production reached a commercial output. Oh, sorry. That's right. So, in Ezekiel 3:22-23, God says to Ezekiel, "Get up and go out to the plain, and there I'll speak to you." And Ezekiel continues, "So I got up and went out to the plain, and the glory of the Lord was standing there." Is this a trivial detail? No, because when you read right through Ezekiel, you find that most of it is focused on Jerusalem and its landscape, on the mountains, the hills, the valleys and ravines of Judea. The contrast is striking and is meant to be. There's another aspect of Assyrian and Babylonian life that's worth noting here, the use of proverbs. If you read through Ezekiel, you'll have found that on 3 occasions, God uses proverbs to make his point. Now, apart from the obvious fact that there's a book of Proverbs in the Bible, actually, Proverbs are very rarely quoted in the rest of its text. So Ezekiel stands out. "Son of man, what is this proverb you have in the land of Israel? The days go by and every vision comes to nothing." Or, "Everyone who quotes Proverbs will quote this proverb about you, like mother, like daughter. The word of the Lord came to me. What do you mean by quoting this proverb about the land of Israel? The parents eat sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge." Wisdom and experience were transmitted down the generations in the past by proverbs, but the Babylonians were particularly fond of them. In Babylon, proverbs served as the standard educational text from a boy's first introduction to literacy through to his appointment as a scribe, and all his writing practices consisted of copying out proverbs. Many ancient Mesopotamian proverbs will remind us of our own. For example, the Sumerian proverb, "Upon escaping from the wild ox, the wild cow confronted me," is just an earlier version of the modern saying, "Out of the frying pan into the fire." Ashurbanipal's library, he was the last great Assyrian king, was discovered in the excavations at Nineveh, and because clay tablets survive, it's just astonishing what has survived, it included a mass of clay tablets inscribed with earlier Sumerian and Babylonian proverbs. Proverbs were how people connected with their past. Through them, they passed on their concerns, hopes, humour, relationships, fears and joys. And if you go into the ancient Near Eastern Gallery in the Ashmolean, you'll find a display there of their proverbs. So Ezekiel was closely reflecting the Babylonian milieu in which he was prophesying. But it's also important to note that proverbs cement tradition. Societies basing their lives on proverbs are inevitably conservative. They're rooted in their past. And that actually has encouraged me that I can use images which predate Ezekiel's arrival in Babylonia to illustrate what the people who lived around him in Babylonia believed and the cultural world of which they were part. That is the background. Sorry it's taken so long, but I think it's worth explaining. So now to the vision. Now, a vision has to relate to those who see it or to contemporaries who are told about it. Hence, the images must relate here to the world of the Israelites, the different peoples around them, and their masters, the Babylonians in the 6th century BC. So if we find it confusing in our own day, we must find out how it relates to their day. I'll come to him in a minute. The vision, Ezekiel 1:4, starts with a violent storm coming out of the north, an immense cloud, flashing lightning, and surrounded by brilliant light. The center of the fire looks like glowing metal. First, why the north? Well, to the north of Babylon were the mountains, and the people of the settled, cultivated lands of Mesopotamia lived in fear of what might come out of the mountains, be it people or wild animals. And one of the keys to Cyrus the Persian's success later on was that he came from the mountains. So this is a threatening start to the vision. As to the storm, God in the Old Testament was associated with thunder and lightning, as on Mount Sinai in Exodus 19, when morning dawned on the third day, there was thunder, lightning, and a thick cloud on the mountain. And that sort of image was true throughout the ancient Near East, where violent storms, thunder and lightning, and fire were universally seen as relating to the gods. In particular, the Babylonian weather god Adad was feared for thunderstorms and hurricanes, while according to one Egyptian myth, the home and birthplace of the Egyptian sun god Re was said to be the Isle of Fire. So these words of introduction provide a fearsome, awesome background to what follows and encompass both Old Testament Jewish belief and the pagan world around it. Next, we meet 4 living creatures, human in appearance, each with 4 faces and 4 wings, with human hands under their wings, with straight legs and calves' feet. So they're human in that they have a head, stand upright on 2 legs, and have hands and presumably arms under their wings. But they have 4 faces, not 1, and these faces are in the form of a human, a lion, a bull, and an eagle. So let's get into the animal world of Iraq and Syria in the Assyrian and Babylonian period. There we go. Sorry, this flicks. Right, well done. It's very difficult for us in today's world to imagine the ancient Near East, where wild animals existed in their thousands and where the shepherd's need to fight off lions and leopards was a daily occurrence. The Asiatic lion is now confined to 2 small regions of India, but in Old Testament times there were literally thousands of lions in what is now Saudi Arabia, eastern Turkey, Iran, and Iraq. Even as late as the 1850s, lions were plentiful in Iraq. As Layard, who was the excavator of Nineveh, tells us, "Lions abound," he writes. "I've seen them frequently, and during the excavations at Nippur we found fresh traces of their footsteps almost daily among the ruins." Hence the numerous references to lions in the Bible, not least Ezekiel 19 verses 1 to 9, with its poetic image of a lioness rearing strong young lions. "What a lioness was your mother among the lions. She lay down among them and reared her cubs. She brought up one of her cubs, and he became a strong lion. He learnt to tear the prey, and he became a man-eater." If you live in a world full of wild animals, the 2 most obvious animals for sheer size and power are the lion and the bull. And I've checked on the reading of ox, which appears in the Bible version we've got, and it is the Hebrew word is either an ox or a bull, and I'm sure it's meant to be bull here. And if you're thinking of powerful birds, the eastern imperial eagle, widespread over Western Asia, has a wingspan of up to 2.2 meters, that's 7 feet. Kingship depended in many old world cultures on the ability of a man to prove his manhood and fitness for the role of a ruler by his strength and ability with a suitable weapon, be it a bow and arrow or sword. So he took on the most powerful beast to show his right to rule, and this was how it worked in ancient Mesopotamia. First, the lion. This was the key to Assyrian and Babylonian ideas of kingship through the royal lion hunt. From the 9th century gates of the city of Balawat comes this scene of lions being driven out of the reeds on the left by beaters, showing how numerous they would have been, that you needed beaters to sort of get them moving, and into the path of the oncoming king in his chariot. That's the 9th century BC. By the time of the 7th century, Ashurbanipal, lions were often kept in cages because the lion hunt had become a staged activity of royalty rather than out in the countryside. They were then released, as this one is being released by the man on top, towards the king. And he would either shoot at them on foot, as here, and he's got a shield bearer beside him, just in case things go wrong, and 2 men behind him with his arrows. Here he is, Ashurbanipal himself, killing a wounded lion, holding it by its throat and thrusting a sword into its stomach. Or they might do it on horseback. No, don't want that one. Oh, sorry, something's... No. Well, we're missing one. I don't quite know where it's gone. Or alternatively, in a chariot. And here is a chariot with a king figure in it, and a lion is eating another mortal on the ground. Naturally enough, we find lions embellishing ivory. No, that's... Oh, well, sorry. Doesn't matter. These are of Ashurbanipal, actually, or Assur-Nasirpal, who lived in the 9th century, and I'll come back to this because of the wheels, but this is him shooting a lion, and 2 men behind with shields, and he's in his royal chariot. And then the next one shows Ashurbanipal himself, the last great Assyrian king, in his hunting chariot, and we can't see the lion here because it's deleted, but there he is shooting at it from his royal chariot. And we find lions embellishing ivory in royal situations, and this is a group of ivories from Nimrud, which are in the Ashmolean, Nimrud being one of the Assyrian capitals not far from modern-day Mosul. And if we need any further evidence of the importance of lions, the imperial seal of the Assyrians was of the king stabbing the lion. So lions are absolutely fundamental to power and authority and regality in the Assyrian and Babylonian empires. Now to bulls. From Hierakonpolis, which is in Egypt, it's a pre-dynastic capital of Upper Egypt, come 2 slate palettes which illustrate well the importance of bulls as symbols of royal power. On each of these, a bull is destroying the king's enemies. But first notice that the tops have bulls' heads on them. And here is the picture of one of the bulls killing one of the king's enemies. Here it is. And another from the same site again shows a bull attacking one of the king's enemies here. So they are symbols again of royal power, and they also, you also find bull hunts. And here on the left from Ugarit in Syria earlier, but it shows actually a bull hunt going on with a king in a chariot, and here are the bulls being hunted around. And here's another ivory bull from Nimrud. Eagles couldn't be controlled in the same way as animals, but the Eastern Imperial Eagle was undoubtedly the model of winged strength for the rulers of Mesopotamia. Okay, so that's some of the background to animals. Now to gods. In ancient Mesopotamia, gods were sometimes shown as humans, but often with the animal, which was their symbol. So here is Ishtar, the goddess of sex and war, standing on a lion on the left. And, oh, sorry, that's not right. The Ishtar, sorry, there's a slight, I've got the two in the wrong order, I think. No, I've missed one out. There, that's the one I was wanting. Here is Ishtar, the goddess of sex and war, standing on a lion on the left. And on the right, Adad, the god of weather, throwing a thunderbolt and standing on a bull. So they have this association between gods and animals. But gods were more often symbolized by simple animals, birds, or hybrid animal-bird humans. So on the right here is Lama, who was a Sumerian winged goddess. She has wings and 2 or 3 sets of horns on her. They make it look like a hat, but they're actually 2 or 3 sets of horns, one above the other, on her head. On the left is a figure who's probably the goddess Ishtar again, and she's shown here as a naked female human figure, but with wings, eagle's talons, and more sets of horns on her head. She's standing on the backs of 2 lions, and large owls stand either side of her. And here is an eagle-headed god, possibly Nimrod, a god of agriculture. Now, from the name Lama, who was the Sumerian winged goddess we saw just now, comes the word Lamassu, which means a benevolent guardian figure. Such guardian figures were also hybrid, and their hybrid form combined the powers of the different animals in order to protect a city and its palace. It was believed that doorways could allow dangerous supernatural forces to enter the palace. So, here is one Lamassu, which guarded the palace at Nimrud, near Mosul, in the 9th century BC. That's in the British Museum, and here from the Louvre are the Lamassu which guarded the gates of the palace of Sargon II at the end of the 8th century at Khusabad, near Nineveh, near Mosul again. And these are all winged bulls with human heads. So too at Nineveh, they're in human-headed bulls and lions. A slightly different figure was an Akpalu, which usually had a bird or animal head and was said to bring wisdom as well as protection. And this shows you an Akpalu at the top there and on the left, and then a lion man below. And the Akpalu figure on the left is a clay figure which was used for burial under the floor, again for protection. And that comes from Nimrud. Other guardian figures were sphinxes imported from Egypt. Now then, this is difficult to see because it's a tiny seal, but a fascinating seal in the Ashmolean made of jasper shows a winged sphinx, but it has a Hebrew inscription which says, belonging to Hannah. Much of the first half of Ezekiel has the prophet expressing God's anger at the way his people were following other gods. Here's a tiny piece of evidence showing that this Hebrew lady had a pagan sphinx on her seal, nothing to do with the God of Israel. Now, as Ezekiel chapter 8 makes clear, God is acutely aware of the idol worship going on in Jerusalem. He first takes issue with the idol of jealousy, second with a god by the name of Tammuz, and third the worship of the sun. Of the idol of jealousy in Ezekiel 8:5 we know nothing, but Tammuz in Ezekiel 8:14 refers to a fertility god. He was associated with the fertility of the different annual seasons, or because he was also identified as a shepherd, with the annual migration cycles of the shepherd and his herds. So the women sitting and mourning the god Tammuz in the temple that God shows Ezekiel are presumably mourning the reduced fertility of the land in the autumn and winter in preparation for the joys of spring. As to the sun, Shamash, which in Ezekiel 8:16 is being worshipped by 25 men inside the temple in Jerusalem, the sun god has survived in a number of images. This limestone tablet shows a man who is apparently a patron of the sun temple at Sippar, just north of Babylon, being led by a priest and the goddess Ah into the presence of Shamash, the sun god who is seated in his temple. Before the god is his symbol, the solar disk. In the field above the sun god, you can just see there, are 3 disks, one a lunar, one a solar, and one an 8-pointed star. And these are the symbols of Sin, the moon god, Shamash, the sun god, and Ishtar, the fertility goddess. Shamash wears a horned headdress and carries a ringed rod, presumably symbolizing his divine authority, in his right hand, and the shrine is represented as resting on the heavenly ocean. There it is. And we notice that the sun god's throne is supported by what animals? Lions. Now, the objects I've shown you so far, most of which date from the 9th to 8th century BC, predate Ezekiel, who prophesied between 592 and 570. However, he was exactly contemporary with the main gate, the Ishtar gate of the city of Babylon, constructed in 575. 5 rows of lamassu, guardian figures, decorate the towers of the gateway against a background of wonderful blue glazed tiles. All the figures are associated with Babylonian gods. The gate was dedicated to Ishtar, and she is symbolized by the lions. As I've already said, she's the goddess of fertility, love, war, and sex. The bulls symbolize Adad, the weather god, while the snake dragon Mushushu symbolizes Marduk, the chief patron god of Babylon. And Mushushu means apparently furious snake, but the animal's body, this curious thing here, combines the head and scales of a snake, the claws of an eagle, the legs of a lion, and a tail ending in a scorpion's stinger. So, as we read on in Ezekiel 1, verses 5 to 12, we realize that Ezekiel was seeing 4 lamassu, guardian figures with their hybrid features. We also discover that the cherubim of the Bible are the biblical equivalent to lamassus. For in chapter 10, verse 15, Ezekiel actually says that the cherubim whom he could see at that point were the same living creatures he'd seen by the river Kibar in chapter 1. So we now understand the cherubim and their presence on the Ark of the Covenant. They were winged guardian figures for the Ark and would have been understood by the Israelites in that way. And Ezekiel would have understood the 4 guardian figures in his vision as representing God's heavenly world. Now let's move on to the wheels which Ezekiel saw. No, don't want those yet. Sorry, we've got them overlaid. Are they all? They're not overlaid on that. I don't know quite. No, that's not next. Okay, well, I can go back and show you the previous pictures. If we go back to the chariots. Right. Okay. Kings were normally portrayed either on their throne or in their chariot. What Ezekiel sees is the throne chariot of the heavens. Just as human kings had chariots, so did deities. The vision that Ezekiel sees is therefore of the God of Israel in his 6th century throne chariot. And let's look at the details. Traditionally, a Mesopotamian god or king would have had a battle or hunting chariot with 2 wheels drawn by 2 horses. Well, the next one shows the 2 horses. No, neither of them do. That was later on, but anyway, it doesn't matter. By the time, but the chariot maintained its prestige as the royal vehicle after battle chariots had actually given way to cavalry. And this is what had happened by the time Ezekiel was writing. Battle chariots give way to cavalry, but the chariot remains the royal vehicle. And it also remained the vehicle used by top officials, including the standard bearers of Nergal, the god of death, destruction and war, and Adad, the storm god, which always led the Assyrian army into battle. Hence, chariots were reduced or perhaps elevated to more ceremonial use. But pictures of royal chariots all suggest they got taller and that their wheels got increasingly large in the Assyrian period. So here, for example, is Ashurnasirpal's in the 9th century, and as you can see, the wheel has only 6 spokes, and it's got a plain edge, which is important to notice. It's just wood with 6 spokes, and it's small compared to the size of the horse. Right. Compared to Ashurbanipal's wheels, which have 8 spokes and are massive, they are the height of the horse, or even higher than its rump. The advantage of extra height for the king was that he could be seen better in processions, or if this was being used in battle, would have more of a bird's eye view. Hence, Ezekiel 1:18, their rims were high and awesome, because the size of chariot wheels has gone so high. Now, the outer surfaces of chariot wheels by Ashurbanipal's time, and you can see it here, were also bound with studded metal tires. This ensured a better grip to avoid skidding and to allow a tighter turning circle. Such large chariot wheels suggest the reason not only for Ezekiel saying they're high and awesome, but also for his mentioning them so often. They dominate the side view of the royal chariots. So if you were looking at a chariot, what you essentially see is this huge wheel. Chariot wheels were, of course, the most important functional features of chariots, and the loss of a wheel in battle was a disaster. Hence the way God threw the Egyptian army into confusion as they were chasing after the Israelites before the crossing of the Red Sea. He made the wheels of their chariots come off, so the writer puts it, so that they had difficulty driving. I think they did. And the Egyptians said, "Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." That's Exodus 14. So Mesopotamian kings would often seek priestly help through divination to be sure that the chariot wheels would not come off in the forthcoming battle. In Ezekiel's vision, there's no mention of horses. There are simply 4 wheels, and each wheel seems to have a wheel inside it, which enables the chariot to go in any direction without turning. So in each pair, the inner wheel must be at right angles to the outer wheel. This gives the chariot extraordinary mobility. It can go in any direction without turning round, compared to an ordinary chariot, which would have to do a circle to get back the way it had come. Moreover, the wheels would not have been stressed by having to corner sharply or corner at speed. Ezekiel's design of wheel corresponds to the 4 faces of each guardian figure. But another feature of the wheels is lots of eyes. Now we'll go back to the eyes, which are further on. Right. The question is, were they the studs on the metal tires, or were they actually eyes? And these votive offerings from a Bronze Age temple in Syria, on the right, show the importance of eyes in early Near Eastern culture. Now, they could be literally eyes that Ezekiel is talking about, suggesting that God goes about inspecting his domain. For the Egyptians, though, eyes shone, beamed, flashed, and glowed. So eyes became tokens of authority, and they were also symbols of fire. The sun and moon were the eyes of the god Horus, of whom it was written, "When he opens his eyes, he fills the universe with light. But when he shuts them, darkness comes into being." So fascinatingly, eyes were not just for seeing, they gave out a message. It's interesting too to note that in the Middle East, the evil eye is all about what an eye gives out, not what it sees. Now, it could well be that the eyes in the vision represent stars, numerous studs on the wheel, numerous stars. In that case, since they're attached to the four wheels, they could represent four groups of stars or star constellations. If so, it's been suggested that they are the constellations which mark the four cardinal points of the year: Taurus, Leo, Scorpius, and Capricornus. But if that is so, are they related to the four faces? Leo would give us the face of the lion and Taurus the face of the bull. However, I've been unable to find a link between Scorpio and a human face, or Capricorn and an eagle's face, or vice versa. In any case, the Babylonians didn't recognize the constellation of Capricorn, which only became identified as a constellation with the Greeks. The Babylonians saw in the sky the great swallow, which incorporates Pisces with part of Pegasus. So the great swallow is in the right direction of the sky, opposite Leo, but I've been unable to pursue this symbolism any further, and I'd be interested to know if anyone else knows more about Babylonian astrology can help on that one. But the number 4 is certainly significant. 4 is the sacred number used in the Old Testament for completeness. So we have 4 rivers of paradise in Genesis 2, the 4 corners or 4 quarters of the earth in Isaiah 11, the 4 dreadful punishments inflicted by God in Ezekiel 14, the 4 winds of heaven in Ezekiel 37, and multiples of 4, 40, 400, 4,000, are used for large numbers in the same way. So the fact that there are 4 cherubim shows the completeness of the picture that Ezekiel is seeing, as is the fact that the chariot apparently has 4 identical sides, that the cherubim have 4 faces, and that the fact that they can move in all 4 directions. And then the fact that the eyes or stars are attached to the 4 wheels could show that they represent the 4 directions, north, south, east, and west, or possibly the 4 seasons of the year, in which case the chariot can roam throughout the universe and through time with equal facility. And in whichever direction the cherubim moved, the throne chariot moves with them, because the spirit of the cherubim permeates the wheels. In other words, they are the chariot. So this is far more than a royal Assyrian or Babylonian wooden chariot. This is a chariot of extraordinary inner power, impact, and range. Then we come to the something like a vault, sparkling like crystal and awesome. Below it stand the living creatures, the cherubim, and above it is the throne with God seated on it. In the ancient Near East, the basic elements of the cosmos included a flat earth, a solid layer above the sky called the firmament, a cosmic ocean located above the firmament, a region above the cosmic ocean where the gods lived, and a netherworld, the furthest region in the direction downwards. So Ezekiel's vision follows this in a slightly simplified form. The vault is the firmament, and above it is where God is, though the volume of noise which Ezekiel heard could suggest the cosmic ocean as well. And finally, at the very heart of the vision, high above the firmament, on actually a lapis lazuli throne, though it's sometimes translated otherwise in the Bibles, but it must be lapis lazuli, because lapis lazuli is this wonderful deep blue, which was always used in the ancient Near East to represent the sky and the cosmos. But anyway, there is a figure like that of a man, full of fire and light, radiant as a rainbow. Now, a rainbow, of course, is very beautiful, but the way it's included in Ezekiel's vision may take us by surprise. It certainly took me by surprise because I don't think of rainbows in that way. However, in the ancient Near East, the rainbow was the crown of the god Ninurta. A Sumerian document records Ninurta, who makes the good tiara, the rainbow, flash like lightning. Ninurta was a god of war, though also of farming, and the Assyrian kings were devoted to him as a god who would help them in war against their enemies. In fact, Ashurbanipal II in the 9th century built a temple to him adjacent to his ziggurat. So the radiance of the figure on the throne chariot, full of fire and light, may have been much more dynamic than our image of a rainbow. So where have we got to? Well, to summarize, Ezekiel's vision perfectly relates to the cultural, religious, and artistic background of the day. Ezekiel sees 4 guardian figures which form the 4 sides of the throne chariot of God, with their compound wheels allowing them to go in any direction without having to turn. The wheels are each decorated with eyes or stars which appear to give out light and may represent the heavens. This chariot is permeated by the very spirit of the guardian figures. So this is a chariot beyond any chariot belonging to any king or other god. This vision is appropriately accompanied by storms, fire and lightning, and in the centre, high above the firmament, in the place of the gods, surrounded by fire and light, is the throne of God himself, occupied by a figure like that of a man. This vision was evidently sent by God to launch Ezekiel on his prophetic mission. But what would it have said to him and to other Jewish captives during their time of exile? It's important to understand here that after the capture of a city, not only were its king and his family transported to Assyria, but also its gods. Their temples were left behind ownerless, their cities without divine protection, and no worship was therefore possible. Hundreds of gods from the entire Near East arrived in Ashur, the Assyrian capital, this way. Assur, primeval king of the gods, was the patron god of the Assyrian capital, Ashur. Captured gods would be subordinated to him and become part of his royal household, often being housed in his temple. Though not documented, it seems highly likely that Nebuchadnezzar would have taken the Ark of the Covenant, along with all the temple silver recorded in the book of Daniel, to Babylon in 587 or 582 BC at the time of the 2nd or 3rd deportation. And he would have treated it in the same way as the Assyrians would have done. So the Judeans might easily have believed not only that God had been defeated, but that he'd been severely downgraded and was occupying a corner of the temple of another god, an idol. But the vision given to Ezekiel showed them that God had not been defeated and he hadn't ended up sidelined in a temple in Babylon. Instead, his vision showed that he remained seated in his throne chariot at the center of his domain, the entire cosmos. He was in control of everything. That would have provided the certainty that Ezekiel needed to see and know. But his vision shows us more. Whereas the Babylonians were polytheists, Babylon contained at least 8 temples to different gods, including Adad, Shamash, Ishtar, Ninurta, and Marduk, which I've mentioned before. The God of Ezekiel, however, is one. Secondly, he's not a god confined to a place or area, as were some of the Babylonian gods, and indeed many of the Israelites believed that God was meant to live in Jerusalem. But now Ezekiel knows God is free to move wherever he chooses. Thirdly, he's mobile. The Assyrians gave their top officials throughout the empire a gold signet ring with a copy of the imperial seal on it so that they could act on behalf of the king, because the king could not be everywhere. God, however, can be everywhere. Fourthly, he's not a wooden, metal, or stone idol. He's not material at all, but spirit. Fifthly, we are made in his image, hence his representation as something like a human. And just as we are living beings and the Lamassu are described in Ezekiel as living creatures, so he is a living God. Sixthly, he's personal because the vision is specifically directed to Ezekiel. And of course, he then speaks to Ezekiel personally. Seventhly, idols have only one or two attributes, e.g. the solar disk of Shamash, the sun god, or the lunar crescent of Sin, the moon god. God has them all. In fact, he encompasses everything: the human race, the lion, the bull, and the eagle. These last three faces of the Lamassu are symbols of power for humans and symbols too of the gods, but they all belong to him. Psalm 62:11 says, "Power belongs to you, O God." This is the awesome God with the human face. Eighth, finally, just as Ezekiel's prophecies in Ezekiel 34 about the Good Shepherd and in Ezekiel 47 about the new temple from which the living water flows both look forward to the coming of Jesus, so the image of God in Ezekiel 1 as a figure like that of a man is also prophetic. For it too looks forward to the coming of Jesus the Christ, the Messiah, or as Syriac, the successor to Aramaic in the Eastern Christian Church, would write it, Yeshua Mashiach, Jesus the Messiah. Thank you very much.
Whoa. Oh, well done. Look, we're still with him, aren't we? We could go another hour, but we won't. Everyone, we understand that some of you might need to leave now, but actually we will also encourage you just to talk to your neighbours for a few minutes, just to think, just to comment really, and if you have some questions that you would like to ask one another, first of all, because you might be able to answer it for one another, then do so, or write it down on the papers that are in the pews, and we'll collect them, and we'll give James a little go at answering a few of them, okay? But as he claimed at the beginning, this isn't his area of specialty. Who knew, after all that? But he is very, very happy to, we'll go through the questions and we'll see which ones will be most helpful for us together. And I hope you'll understand it won't be all of them. But you know where James lives, so you can go and see him. Is that okay? Yeah, so do feel free. If you need to leave, we get that. But also just talk to those around you and feel free to write some questions down. And we'll see what James can do with that. Okay. In terms of timing, we'll aim to finish in about 15 minutes. Okay, if that gives you an idea of getting your hot water bottles ready, because it is a cold April evening. Okay. Okay, we're going to just have a few comments from James, and over to him.
Somebody's asked about the similarities between the Proverbs of Solomon and the Babylonian Proverbs. I think what's more significant in the book of Proverbs, as I understand it, is there's a group of proverbs there which actually are almost identical to a group of Egyptian proverbs from a contemporary period. And so that shows the link southwards with Israel and Proverbs. There isn't, as far as I'm aware, nobody has come up with a group of proverbs which look the same from the Babylonian end and the Israelite end. And the other question here about, I'm afraid, in what way could you say the four living creatures, Lamassu of Revelation 4, correlate to this vision? I'm afraid I haven't gone into Revelation yet. I've spent the last month trying to get hold of Ezekiel. So I'm afraid that's for some future lecture by somebody else. Any others? Yes. When Israel was taken over by the Assyrians, they repopulated Samaria. They depopulated and repopulated with other peoples to effectively mix up everybody. Jerusalem was left completely empty, which was why you have the exiles going back to rebuild the walls first and then rebuild the temple in sequence, because there's nothing there. There are probably a few people living in odd lives in odd broken down buildings, but there's nothing otherwise. So what was the question? Sorry. Yes. Yes, that's exactly it. And also, if you move people around, as the Ottomans and so many other people have discovered, you keep people subservient to you because they're always in a foreign part. They can't rebel in the same way. And then the complete change comes around under the Achaemenids with Cyrus, who decides that the people can go back to their own homes and their own lands. And that's highly significant because that's a complete change of direction from a conqueror. And hence, in Isaiah, why Cyrus is so hailed as such a beneficial figure.
Thank you, James. I've got one last question. Having studied what you have, you're a man of faith. You know, you've had a faith in Jesus for centuries, decades. Well, over centuries. How was this study? How does it shape your faith? Because, you know, it can feel quite academic and wordy.
Yes, it can.
You know, and I'm not denying what we've learned. It's been incredible. But has it made an impact on you personally?
Yes.
Encourage us to read again, or
yes, it has.
Tell us
I mean, I don't think Ezekiel's an easy book, and there's a huge amount of God telling the Israelites what he thinks of them and all their sins, which is quite troublesome reading. But putting together this and this vision that Ezekiel has really touched me. I mean, it just shows how in the Bible God is there in a big way, and it's so easy to overlook, not read the whole of the text and just look at the bit that suits you. And this didn't suit me at all, which was why it was so exciting to see that it's got so much riches in it. And if one understands more of the Ezekiel scene, it's had a big impact on me. It's increased my faith. It makes me just see how great God is, how he is everywhere. He is majestic. He's over all our worldly pursuits. He's far bigger than Putin or Trump or any of these people. They're tiny. They're grasshoppers, as the Bible would say. So yes, it's been fantastic. May you get the same thrill out of it, reading it as I have.